Hey guys, today we're diving into another truly horrifying case. If you want to support my channel, make sure to subscribe and stay active. It really helps me out. I'd be super grateful for that. Let's get started. On the evening of December 2nd, 2010, around 7 p.m. in Melbourne, Australia, a maintenance worker headed down to the garbage room located in the service area of a residential high-rise on St. Kilda Road. When he tried to open the door, it wouldn't budge. Something seemed to be blocking it from the inside. After a few attempts, he managed to wedge it open just slightly. Concerned, he called the building concierge. Together, they returned and checked the access logs. The lighting inside the room was dim, casting long shadows over the equipment that had clearly been shifted out of place. There were irregular marks on the floor. Things didn't look the way they were supposed to. Near the garbage chute, the hatch seemed to be improperly secured. At the threshold of the room, they noticed shattered debris and a faint, smeared footprint. They didn't go inside. Instead, they left the door slightly ajar, noted the time, and reported the situation to the building manager and emergency services. Soon after, access to the floor was restricted. The elevator was switched to service mode, and building security blocked off the corridor. Upstairs, residents continued on with their evening routines, completely unaware that something deeply troubling had just been discovered beneath their feet. As two staff members waited in silence for the police to arrive, neither of them yet realized what that door was hiding. Phoebe Hansjuk was born on May 9th, 1986. From a young age, she had a vivid imagination. She built her own worlds, using creativity as her outlet. Her warmth and friendly nature made her stand out. She lived actively, played basketball, and thrived in outdoor games. The ocean was her sanctuary. She found peace in nature and cherished moments with her friends under open skies. Despite her lively exterior, Phoebe carried a quiet vulnerability. In her teenage years, she went through emotional lows and experimented with prohibited substances. Later, she turned to alcohol as a way to calm her anxiety. These struggles led her to seek professional support, therapy, and eventually prescribed treatment in hopes of finding balance. Phoebe was a mix of light-hearted joy and deep introspection. She could be the life of the party, always smiling, always present. But in private moments, she would turn inward. In friendship, she was a rock, loyal, selfless, and dependable. At home, she was tender and protective, especially toward her siblings, who confided in her freely. By the time she was 23, Phoebe had taken a job as a front desk administrator at a salon. The role suited her. She liked order, handled responsibilities effortlessly, and got along with just about everyone. Outside of work, she poured herself into art. It was how she processed emotion, how she made sense of the world. To Phoebe, the real treasures in life weren't things. They were experiences, connections, and moments shared. Phoebe had clear plans for her future. She was determined to travel overseas and join volunteer missions in India. It wasn't about sightseeing. It was about helping people, finding meaning, and gaining real-life experience. She actively researched opportunities, mapped out her journey, and was preparing to make it happen. Back in school, Phoebe wasn't known for flash or popularity, but for her ability to bring people together, and for being reliable. Her strength came from within. One of her closest confidants was her grandmother, someone she could talk to openly about anything, her goals, her fears, even the treatments she was going through. Her grandmother always listened without judgment and offered unwavering support. Phoebe's life was a delicate balance of outward energy and deep personal struggle. Her ability to connect with people was genuine, but behind the smile was someone fighting hard to stay grounded. That inner battle shaped both her friendships and her need for emotional support during tougher times. In 2009, while working as a front desk manager at a salon, Phoebe met 39-year-old events promoter Anthony Hampel. He came from a high-profile Melbourne family. His father, George Hampel, was a retired Supreme Court judge, and his stepmother, Felicity Hampel, served as a judge on the county court. Anthony moved in elite circles, cultivated connections, and was known for carefully curating his public image. That fall, Phoebe moved in with him at the Balencia Apartments on St. Kilda Road, a luxury high-rise with over 80 units, 24/7 security, a gym, pool, sauna, spa, and restaurant. It was top-tier real estate. Apartments in the building were valued at up to $1.5 million. Their unit was on the 12th floor, offering sweeping views of the city's parks. Anthony's lifestyle revolved around corporate events, networking dinners, and constant interaction with powerful people. His world was one of status, polish, and performance. Phoebe, on the other hand, valued simplicity, time with friends, art, nature. That difference became increasingly apparent as they settled into life together. At first, their relationship was fueled by mutual attraction and curiosity. Anthony welcomed her into his world, but it was a world built around his preferences. Over time, things began to shift. He started making comments about her clothing, discouraging her from seeing certain friends, and expecting her to adapt to his high society environment. Phoebe began to feel the pressure and opened up to those close to her. According to her family and mental health professionals, the emotional strain was mounting. Phoebe described feeling verbally pushed around, as if her choices were being second-guessed or steered. She often said she wanted support, not restrictions, and she was determined to hold on to her independence. This set off a cycle, brief periods of calm and reconciliation followed by rising tensions and conflict. Each time Phoebe would bring up her intention to leave. Her family knew about these moments. So did her therapist. One day, her grandmother gently told her, if she truly wanted out, she should end it peacefully and walk away on her own terms. Phoebe tried to distance herself from Anthony's world. She started focusing on her own projects again and made efforts to set boundaries. But any changes that came never lasted long. The controlled atmosphere of their apartment, combined with Anthony's high-profile circle, created an illusion of stability that only deepened her sense of dependency. Anthony's family took a keen interest in the relationship. They even raised the idea of formalizing it legally, something Phoebe's family pushed back against. For Phoebe, it was a matter of principle, the right to make her own choices, to decide for herself who to trust and how to live her life. In late November, Phoebe had a video call with her mother. Knowing Phoebe was preparing to leave Anthony, her mom was surprised to see her daughter still at his apartment. When she asked about the status of their relationship, Phoebe silently gestured to stay quiet and dodged the question, saying they were just watching a movie in the other room. The next evening, the couple had dinner with Matt and Julia Rockman. During the meal, Phoebe tried to bring up the issues in their relationship to Julia, but Anthony quickly cut her off and shifted the topic. After dinner, in the underground parking garage, a heated argument broke out. Phoebe, visibly upset, walked off and contacted an old friend, asking to meet up for drinks. According to the friend, they spent about an hour at a bar in a calm setting. During that time, Phoebe's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Anthony called her 27 times in less than an hour. Overwhelmed, Phoebe impulsively threw her iPhone across the street. Later that night, Phoebe showed up at her mother's home. They had a long, serious talk. This wasn't a conversation about fixing the relationship. It was about how to leave safely without more conflict. Phone records later showed that the next morning, Phoebe returned to the apartment she shared with Anthony. What followed was a series of calls for help. She reached out to the crisis team at Alfred Hospital, her doctor, and her therapist. During a 30-minute session with the therapist, she opened up about using substances and the escalating tension in her home life. She wasn't just venting, she was actively asking for guidance on how to avoid relapse and keep the situation from spiraling further. The events of December 2nd, 2010 were pieced together through building access logs, surveillance footage, and Anthony's own statement. He said he left the apartment around 8 a.m., with Phoebe still asleep. At 8:45 a.m., an email was sent from Phoebe's computer. Over the next hour, short bursts of user activity were recorded. At 11:43 a.m., a fire alarm was triggered. Security cameras in the lobby and hallways captured Phoebe calmly exiting the building with her dog. No signs of panic, no rush. The alarm turned out to be false. There was no planned drill, and no official evacuation followed. At 11:50 a.m., Phoebe returned through the main entrance and took the elevator back up to her floor. That was the last time she appeared on surveillance footage that day. Around 6 p.m., Anthony arrived home and noticed things were off. There were shards of glass near the desk area, likely from a broken item on the desktop. Small specks of blood were found on the keyboard and surrounding surface, including a stained mouse pad. On the couch lay a torn pillowcase. The front door showed no signs of forced entry. In the kitchen, Phoebe's purse, wallet, and keys were found, but her phone was missing. 2 used wine glasses were sitting on the dining table, but there were no signs of a meal being prepared. No plates, no silverware, nothing set out for dinner. In the hallway and living room, faint streaks on the floor extended from the desk area toward the apartment entrance. The origin of these marks couldn't be determined. Near the front door, there was a large shoe print, noticeably bigger than those typically left by maintenance or cleaning staff. At 6:51 p.m., Phoebe's father tried calling her iPhone, but the call went straight to voicemail. 1 minute later, at 6:52 p.m., Anthony called her father, saying he didn't know where Phoebe was, and that her phone had disappeared from the apartment. At the same time, he remained in contact with friends and colleagues and placed a food order for 1. At 8:10 p.m., the food delivery driver notified a resident that police were present near the service corridor. Only then did Anthony go downstairs to speak with officers and mention that Phoebe was missing and he hadn't been able to reach her. Up until that moment, he hadn't filed a missing persons report or reached out to emergency services. The trash system in the building was a vertical chute, deep and narrow, running from the top floors down to a maintenance area in the basement. It was roughly 130 feet tall, starting around the 12th floor where Anthony and Phoebe lived. The chute was fitted with a heavy metal hatch with an automatic closing mechanism and a narrow opening. At the bottom were bins that collected the trash. It was down this chute that Phoebe fell. The fall was catastrophic. She struck the metal walls on the way down before landing in one of the bins. The impact caused severe injuries. Her legs and pelvis were shattered, and one of her feet was nearly severed. The force of the fall led to significant internal bleeding. Despite the trauma, medical reports confirmed that vital signs were still present at the time of impact. After the fall, Phoebe landed near one of the large trash bins. Despite her devastating injuries, she somehow managed to climb out of the container and onto the concrete floor of the garbage room. Blood traces on the floor revealed her attempts to move, to orient herself. She couldn't stand due to the extent of her injuries and severe blood loss, but the marks showed she repeatedly changed positions, trying to make her way toward the door. The room was pitch black. There were no windows, and the light switch had to be turned on manually. Phoebe had only her sense of touch to guide her as she inched forward in the darkness. Eventually, her strength gave out, and the trail stopped. A pool of blood formed beneath her, surrounded by the imprints of her hands, evidence that she remained conscious and was fighting to survive until the very end. The medical examiner determined that Phoebe's death wasn't immediate. She remained alive and aware for some time after the injuries. Ultimately, she passed due to acute blood loss. The trauma, broken bones, ruptured vessels, and internal damage made long-term survival impossible, but her body struggled to hold on. One disturbing detail stood out during the investigation. Phoebe's jeans were found pulled down to her knees. This was inconsistent with a standard fall, where clothing would typically remain in place. This anomaly was never adequately explained during the inquiry. Her final moments were spent in total isolation. The trash room was heavily soundproofed, so even if she had screamed or tried to call for help, no one would have heard her. No residents reported hearing any unusual noises. Effectively, Phoebe had been trapped in complete darkness with no way to get help. When law enforcement arrived on the scene, they quickly concluded that the outcome was clear and blocked paramedics from approaching the body. This decision prevented medical personnel from determining the exact time of death or how long Phoebe might have survived after the fall. The first responding officers almost immediately categorized the case as self-harm. In those initial hours, no neighbors were interviewed, not all surveillance footage was collected, and the building's CCTV system, which automatically overrode itself every 48 hours, wasn't paused. A staff member even suggested preserving the hard drive, but that advice was ignored. Later, the hard drive went missing entirely, along with any potential data showing Phoebe's last movements. Inside the apartment, critical forensic steps were skipped. The used wine glasses weren't collected or analyzed. No fingerprints were taken. Bloodstains weren't examined. There was no proper documentation of the blood spatter pattern, and no effort was made to determine the origin of the shattered glass. A large shoe print found near the front door wasn't photographed or recorded. The door frames and windows weren't tested for trace evidence. Key electronic devices, including laptops and a desktop computer, were never taken into custody. They remained accessible and unsecured. Phoebe's phone was never recovered, and Anthony's devices weren't seized either. As a result, valuable digital data, activity logs, drafts, unsaved notes, were lost. Access to the building that evening was loosely monitored. In theory, an entry fob was required to get in, but anyone accompanied by a resident could bypass security without leaving a digital trace. Law enforcement never attempted to reconstruct Anthony's potential visitor activity that night. They didn't pull full guest access logs from the front desk, nor did they cross-reference those with elevator or key card data. Staff members noted that some visitors could have entered without leaving any trace at all. While the service area was secured, the apartment itself was never fully locked down for a proper forensic investigation. Anthony continued to move freely, talking on the phone, receiving deliveries. This introduced secondary contamination into the environment and disrupted microscopic evidence, reducing the reliability of any later reconstruction. Officers didn't document the condition of his clothing and shoes upon arrival, nor did they collect control samples to compare with the unidentified footprints found inside the apartment. The theory of self-inflicted harm was established shockingly fast. Within just a few hours, official statements began leaning heavily toward this interpretation. The case files provided no clear reasoning for such a quick conclusion. Despite the lack of a note, any documentation of planning or evidence of intent, the case was quickly categorized. By the end of the first week, investigators had no coherent timeline of who went where or did what. Yet the theory that Phoebe voluntarily climbed into the chute had effectively become accepted fact, despite the lack of solid evidence. That assumption would form the basis of all conclusions moving forward, making it extremely difficult to re-examine the case later. The official finding labeled it a tragic accident under the influence. Phoebe's toxicology report indicated a blood alcohol level of approximately 0.16%. About 3 times the legal limit for driving in most states, along with traces of 1 or 2 sleep aids. The working theory suggested she had cut herself on glass inside the apartment, became disoriented, picked up a bag of trash, opened the chute hatch, and somehow ended up inside. But that version didn't sit well with Phoebe's family or with independent experts. First, the design of the chute hatch posed serious problems for that theory. The opening was narrow, around 8 inches wide, with no handles and an automatic closing mechanism. Even volunteers attempting to replicate the movement under supervision struggled significantly and required help. Second, the pattern of injuries Phoebe sustained aligned more closely with falling in a posture where her arms were at her sides, not raised above her head, as one would expect if she had dived in voluntarily. Additionally, No fingerprints belonging to Phoebe were found on the chute hatch or the surrounding surfaces, an important gap in the theory that she climbed in on her own. It was also confirmed that she hadn't taken out the trash that day, further discrediting the idea that she fell in while disposing of garbage. These are critical points that undermine the official version. One particularly troubling element involved the position of Phoebe's clothing. When someone enters a narrow vertical shaft on their own, clothing typically remains in place or gets caught at the hips. But in reenactments conducted by independent experts, a different scenario emerged. If a limp body is pushed through the hatch by two people, while the lid is forcibly held open, the jeans can catch at the knees, restricting leg movement and actually making it easier to push the body downward. That outcome mirrored the condition in which Phoebe was found. Linear bruises were observed on Phoebe's forearms and wrists. Police suggested they resulted from hitting the walls of the chute during the fall. However, independent experts hired by Phoebe's family interpreted these marks as consistent with forceful gripping. Despite this, a full investigation into this theory, one that would analyze grip positions or defensive patterns, was never conducted. The official explanation, involving alcohol and sleep aids, conflicted with the logistics of independently accessing the chute. In that impaired state, where coordination and motor skills would have been significantly diminished, operating a spring-loaded hatch, holding it open and maneuvering into it would have been extremely difficult. Independent experts confirmed that performing those actions sequentially in such a state would be nearly impossible. Forensic trace evidence revealed a lack of handprints or grip marks on the inner edge of the hatch or the wall near the entry point, places where anyone climbing in on their own would logically need to brace themselves. There was also a mismatch between the body position required for self-entry, with arms raised overhead, and the angle of the initial impact, as inferred from Phoebe's injuries. While the glass injury might account for the blood found in the apartment, it did nothing to explain the absence of her prints on the hatch mechanism. The forensic pathologists who backed the accidental fall theory pointed to toxicology and the lack of classic signs of struggle, such as skin under the nails or torn hair from an assailant. Critics argued that a flawed initial investigation with missing prints, unchecked zones, and uncollected samples meant no violent scenario could be confidently ruled out. There was also a major issue with determining the time of death. Due to the circumstances and delayed medical intervention, experts couldn't precisely match biological indicators to an actual timeline. In cases like this, knowing exactly when someone died can be key to ruling out or confirming certain versions of events. But in Phoebe's case, that crucial window was lost. Anthony's behavior in the immediate hours and days following the incident stood out, and not in a good way. Officer Justin O'Brien noted a disconnect between Anthony's display of grief and the physical signs typically associated with crying. There were no visible tears, no redness in the eyes, no signs of a runny nose. When it came time to provide a statement, Anthony insisted on typing it himself, citing that he could type fast. During this process, his emotional fluctuations stopped entirely. He appeared calm, focused, and composed. Meanwhile, someone from his social circle told investigators about another contradiction. Online, Anthony behaved as if everything was normal, but in front of visitors, he would switch into a visibly mournful state, almost as if adjusting his emotions to fit the audience. When Phoebe's grandmother visited the apartment, she was struck by how staged it felt. Nearly all of Phoebe's belongings were gone, and only a handful of carefully placed photos of the couple remained in sight. To her family, it felt like an intentional effort to present a curated version of their relationship. Phoebe's friends also reported feeling pressured. One of them, Ellie, received an email from Anthony asking her to vouch for the loving nature of his relationship with Phoebe and to share that version with others. Ellie refused, saying she couldn't speak on Phoebe's behalf and that the claims didn't reflect the truth. Around the same time, a colleague of Phoebe's named Christo began making frequent appearances at the building's concierge desk. He often brought snacks and repeatedly pushed the idea that Phoebe had been suffering from deep depression, claiming she was beyond saving. These visits continued for about 2 weeks. Staff members later said the whole thing felt like an attempt to sway their perception of what had happened. Anthony's personal life outside his relationship with Phoebe also raised eyebrows. One colleague he described as strictly professional appeared in photos and messages that suggested a more intimate connection. Phoebe's circle wasn't judging this from a moral standpoint. They viewed it more as a possible distraction, something that might have affected his focus or behavior during arguments and periods of separation from Phoebe. Anthony was surrounded by a network of influential people, relatives, business associates, and close friends. Together, they acted as a kind of protective shield, providing him with legal counsel, spreading a narrative that benefited him, and working to shut down uncomfortable questions. To Phoebe's family and friends, it felt like a calculated effort to control the story and suppress alternative explanations. Because of the clear imbalance in resources and influence, any follow-up investigation was effectively shaped by conditions favorable to Anthony. This made it significantly harder to challenge the initial findings or push for a broader review of the case. Phoebe's parents and grandfather, however, didn't stay silent. They immediately took on active roles in seeking answers. Her grandfather went so far as to initiate a series of physical tests on the trash chute. The results were compiled into a formal report and submitted directly to the coroner. At the same time, Phoebe's parents pushed for a second, full-scale forensic sweep of the apartment. Their request was denied. Authorities cited prior investigative decisions, adding that any later examination would likely be compromised by contamination. The family formally documented their objections and appealed to higher-ups within the department, urging a re-evaluation of the initial response and scope of evidence collection. Their efforts remained strictly procedural. They filed motions requesting expanded forensic analysis, petitions to preserve digital evidence, and formal inquiries directed at building security and maintenance services. The family compiled a timeline of events and submitted it to investigators, asking for it to be considered alongside alternative theories. They also took steps to raise awareness, alerting stakeholders to key gaps in the investigation, pushing for meetings with department leadership, and requesting reassessments of certain investigative procedures. But their efforts were met with form letter responses reaffirming the sufficiency of the original inquiry and pointing back to the preliminary explanation, an accidental death related to impairment. By the time the case reached the coroner's court, Phoebe's parents and grandfather had assembled an extensive case file. It included the results of independent chute tests, communications with the property management company, police correspondence, documented efforts to gain access to digital accounts, and a growing list of missing or lost evidence. Their core argument was simple. The case was not complete, and it shouldn't be closed, not with so many inconsistencies, oversights, and unanswered questions. The coroner's inquest represented the family's last opportunity to seek formal recognition that Phoebe's death was not just a tragic mishap. Judge Peter White spent several months reviewing evidence, listening to experts, police representatives, attorneys, and the family. He was faced with a fundamental question. What actually happened in December 2010? Was it self-inflicted harm, a tragic accident, or something criminal? The official forensic pathologist stood by the narrative of a fatal combination of alcohol and sleeping medication. That conclusion was convenient for both law enforcement and Anthony's family. It offered a simple explanation that didn't require exploring the possibility of third-party involvement. Phoebe's family presented their own counter-evidence, including results from physical reenactments of the chute scenario. Their attorney, Gemma Khan, emphasized that the physical evidence suggested interference by another person, but the judge rejected these claims. He acknowledged significant flaws in the initial investigation, but stated they didn't alter the core finding. In his view, Phoebe's death was a tragic accident, not an intentional act. That ruling brought the case to a close. No criminal investigation was reopened. For the family, this outcome had further consequences. Most notably, it blocked them from seeking international assistance in retrieving digital data. In the United States, for example, Gmail records couldn't be released because there was no legal determination of a crime. Years later, when the family finally gained partial access to Phoebe's email accounts, they discovered something deeply frustrating. A number of messages had already been permanently deleted. Anthony didn't wait long to take action. He filed a claim with Phoebe's superannuation fund, requesting a death benefit payout on the grounds that they had been in a domestic partnership. His father, George Hampel, a retired judge from the Supreme Court of Victoria, submitted a sworn declaration in support of the claim, stating that the relationship had lasted longer than it actually did. In the end, Anthony received approximately $113,000. After significant pushback from Phoebe's family, Anthony transferred the funds to her brothers. But that gesture did little to ease the tension between the families. For Phoebe's loved ones, the coroner's ruling didn't bring closure. To them, it confirmed something they had long suspected, that the truth had been buried under legal terminology and the influence of the Hampel family. Once the legal proceedings ended, another conflict emerged. Who had the right to make decisions about Phoebe's remains? Anthony refused to identify her body himself, leaving that devastating responsibility to her parents. At the same time, his stepmother, County Court Judge Felicity Hampel, told Phoebe's mother that Anthony should be considered her next of kin. That statement left the family stunned. To them, it felt like an attempt to sideline them from deciding what would happen to their own daughter. What followed was a painful and deeply symbolic outcome. There wasn't one farewell ceremony, but two. Phoebe's parents held a service at a former monastery along the river. Friends and family who had known her for years gathered to share stories about her childhood, her education, her dreams. The atmosphere was quiet, heartfelt, and filled with sorrow. Anthony and his family held a separate memorial at a yacht club. Large portraits of the couple were displayed, and speeches were made about love and a bright future. To many of Phoebe's friends, it all felt staged. The real history, the fights, the emotional tension, was carefully left out. Neither Anthony nor his family attended the cremation or the placement of Phoebe's ashes. Later, subtle signs began to surface, hints that not everyone close to Anthony was entirely at peace with the official story. His sister, Chrissy, became involved in a high-profile investigation involving banned substances. Though she avoided formal charges, she made a cryptic post on social media. "My only hope is that one day the truth comes out." The words were vague, but for Phoebe's parents, they sounded like quiet confirmation. Evidence that even within the Hampel family, not everyone believed the matter was truly closed. Time passed, but Anthony's name would once again surface in connection with tragedy. In June 2018, 25-year-old Bailey Schneider died under circumstances that echoed far too closely what had happened years earlier. She was a vibrant young woman from Melbourne, outgoing, close with her family and friends. Not long before her death, she had confided that her relationship with Anthony had reached a breaking point. She was ready to end it, for good. On the morning of June 24th, Bailey Schneider was at home, texting on her phone. Her parents had stepped out to run errands. When they returned, they found their daughter on the kitchen floor, near a cabinet, with a looped cord around her neck. There was no high anchor point nearby, and the setup looked odd. Police quickly labeled it self-harm, but Bailey's family had immediate doubts. She was tall, about 5 feet 10 inches, and there were no fixtures in the room that could have supported a conventional hanging. Authorities did not secure or examine the phones in the first critical hours, and later, some data had vanished. Investigators never reconstructed how the loop could have tightened in that space. Independent experiments conducted afterward suggested that such a setup would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible, to carry out alone without significant force or support. but none of that made it into the official reports. The investigation dragged on for over a year, and it ended the same way, ruled as self-inflicted harm. For Phoebe's family, this felt like a second blow. Two young women, both had connections to the same man. Both had reportedly told loved ones they were planning to end the relationship shortly before they died, and both were found under suspicious circumstances. In each case, police conducted only surface-level investigations. Crucial digital evidence went missing, and both times, the official conclusion was the same: the victim had taken her own life. That's how the stories of Phoebe Handsjuk and Bailey Schneider became intertwined in the public eye. Was it a coincidence? Or was it something more, a pattern, where key evidence disappeared too quickly and a predetermined narrative was accepted before all possibilities were fully explored? To this day, no clear answers exist. For Phoebe's parents and for Bailey's loved ones, the truth remains out of reach. What they're left with is unresolved grief, and the name Anthony linking both tragedies in a way that continues to raise questions. Thanks for watching, everyone. Your support means a lot to me, and you can help my channel grow by hitting that like button, dropping a comment, and sharing this video. Your engagement really makes a difference. See you soon.